The vast chamber hung in the silent dark of space, suspended above the blue-green swirl of a distant world. Inside, hundreds of alien delegates sat in tiered rings, their forms as varied as the stars they came from. Some armored in chitin, others draped in flowing energy fields, a few little more than hovering orbs of light. This was the grand conclave of the Galactic Concord, and today they would decide the fate of one small noisy species from the Sol system. For over 3 centuries, Earth had been watched. At first with curiosity, then with concern, and finally with something close to dread. Humanity had spread fast, not with sleek war fleets or ancient wisdom, but with stubbornness, loud music, strange art, and an endless stream of contradictory ideas. They built cities that reached the clouds, then argued for decades about whether to tear them down. They cured diseases, then invented new ones by accident. They wrote poetry about peace while testing weapons that could crack continents. To the orderly, logic-driven civilizations of the conquered, humans were a glitch in the system, a chaotic variable that refused to be predicted or contained. Now, after years of debate and dozens of formal complaints, the final vote was called. The motion, Edict of Quarantine, restrict Sol system to native species only. All human vessels prohibited from conquered space. All human cultural exports banned. All diplomatic ties severed. The justification cited unacceptable volatility, unstable social evolution, and risk of mimetic contamination. The voting began. One by one, species cast their choice through bioluminescent pulses, harmonic chimes, or silent neural links. The count scrolled across the central holo display in clean, cold glyphs. When the final tally appeared, 189 in favor, 11 opposed, the chamber did not erupt in cheers or protests. There was only a deep, humming silence, the kind that follows a death sentence. On Earth, the news hit like a storm. In Houston, Marcus Bell stood in his garage, wiping grease off his hands after fixing an old electric bike. The wall screen behind him flickered to life with an emergency broadcast. A calm-voiced anchor explained the Concord's decision in plain terms. Marcus didn't say a word. He just turned off the screen, walked outside, and stared up at the sky. He'd spent 10 years working on orbital tugs, hauling scrap between Luna and Mars. He'd even shaken hands with a Cathari trader once, briefly, awkwardly, before Concord enforcers pulled them apart for unauthorized contact. Now all that was over. Earth was locked in. In Geneva, Leila Torres sat in a quiet office lined with books and datapads. She worked for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, though diplomacy had long been a joke. No one in the Concord truly listened. Still, she'd spent years studying alien languages, customs, legal codes, trying to find a bridge. When the vote results flashed on her terminal, her first thought wasn't anger. It was understanding. They were afraid. Not of human weapons or fleets, Earth had neither in meaningful numbers, but of human ideas. Of the way humans questioned everything, even their own rules. That kind of thinking was dangerous in a galaxy that ran on ancient treaties and unchanging doctrine. Across the planet, reactions poured in. In Mumbai, students burned effigies of conquered envoys. In Oslo, philosophers debated whether isolation might be a blessing. In Nairobi, engineers quietly powered down joint research satellites linked to alien data nets. Governments issued statements, some defiant, some resigned, but no one called for war. Earth couldn't win a war, not against 200 united species, yet something else stirred beneath the surface. Marcus got a call that night, not on his public line, but on an old military frequency he hadn't used since his salvage days. The voice on the other end was gruff, familiar. "You still fly, Bell?" "Only in my dreams," Marcus replied. "Dreams just got real. Meet at Dock 7, midnight, bring your clearance chip." He didn't ask why. He already knew. Lila, too, received a message, an encrypted file tagged with a single word, lexicon. It contained fragments of conquered legal texts, diplomatic logs, and linguistic patterns she'd spent years compiling. Attached was a note. "They banned our ships. They didn't ban our words. What can we do with that?" She smiled for the first time all day. The Concord assumed humanity would sulk, that they'd turn inward, grow bitter, and eventually fade into irrelevance, a footnote in galactic history. They believed rules were walls, but humans had spent millennia climbing walls, digging under them, or simply redefining what a wall even was. In the days that followed, Earth didn't riot. It didn't beg. Instead, it went quiet, too quiet. Factories that once built luxury yachts for off-world tourists now hummed with new blueprints. Universities shifted research from xenobiology to signal encryption and cognitive linguistics. Private companies quietly bought up old freighters claiming they were for asteroid mining. No one mentioned the conquered. No one needed to. Marcus stood on the gantry of Dock 7 looking down at a battered cargo hauler named Odyssey's Whisper. It wasn't much to look at, rusted hull, mismatched thrusters, but the tech inside was new. Phase shield emitters, sensor ghosts, a comms array that could mimic dead space. This wasn't just a ship. It was a whisper in a silent room. Lila, meanwhile, gathered a small team in a basement lab beneath Geneva. They weren't soldiers or spies. They were poets, lawyers, coders, and historians. Their weapon wasn't a gun. It was a story, a legal paradox, a question wrapped in a riddle. They began feeding Earth's messy, beautiful, contradictory culture into formats the conquered couldn't ignore, because their own laws required them to listen to submitted evidence. The conquered had made one mistake. They thought humanity's chaos was weakness. They didn't realize it was a different kind of strength, one that didn't break rules, but made them bend until they lost all meaning. And as Earth prepared its quiet reply, the galaxy remained unaware that the real war had already begun, not with fire, but with thought, not with force, but with freedom. The vote to banish Earth had passed, but humanity had already decided they wouldn't play by those rules. They would write their own. Earth did not collapse after the banishment. It did not weep. It worked. In the months that followed the Concorde's verdict, the planet's surface buzzed with a new kind of energy. Not panic, but purpose. Governments stopped arguing about blame and started sharing data. Corporations that once competed now traded patents like old friends. Even street artists in Rio and Seoul began painting murals not of anger, but of gears, stars, and open books. The message was clear. If the galaxy shut its doors, humanity would build its own. Marcus Bell spent his days inside a sealed hangar on the edge of the Nevada desert. The place had no name on any map, just a number. Site K9. Inside, engineers, ex-pilots, and AI specialists moved like shadows between half-built ships. The Odyssey's Whisper was no longer alone. 3 more vessels sat in various stages of assembly, each fitted with the same strange tech. Phase shield generators that bent light and sensor waves around the hull, making the ships nearly invisible to scanners. They called it ghosting. Marcus tested the systems daily, running silent simulations through asteroid fields and mock patrol zones. He never spoke much, but his hands moved with quiet confidence. He knew these ships weren't meant for war. They were meant for presence, for showing up where they weren't supposed to be, and leaving no trace but doubt. Meanwhile, in Geneva, Lila Torres led a team that grew by the week. They called themselves the Lexicon Group, though no official record used that name. Their office was now a converted subway station deep beneath the city, cooled by underground rivers and shielded from orbital surveillance. Here, linguists decoded alien syntax trees. Philosophers rewrote Earth's legal history into modular logic blocks. Poets turned old folk tales into paradox engines, stories that, when fed into a rigid legal AI, caused it to loop endlessly trying to find a correct interpretation. Lila discovered something vital early on. The Concord's legal system wasn't just strict, it was brittle. It relied on consensus logic. If all parties agreed on the meaning of a rule, the rule held. But if even one party introduced a valid counter-interpretation rooted in precedent, the system had to pause and reevaluate. And Earth had centuries of legal chaos to draw from, cases where juries ignored the law because it felt wrong, where judges ruled based on mercy over text, where entire laws were rewritten after a single powerful speech. To the conquered, this was madness. To Lila, it was ammunition. She began compiling what she called the Earth Doctrine Package. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a collection of human thought, court rulings, protest speeches, song lyrics, even lines from old movies, that all pointed to one idea. Rules must serve people, not the other way around. She encoded it in formats the conquered used: legal XML, diplomatic JSON, even ceremonial glyph streams. It looked like data. It sounded like logic. But underneath it carried the virus of doubt. Back in Houston, Marcus met with a woman named Nora Finch, a former astrophysicist who now ran Earth's orbital salvage network. She handed him a small drive. "This contains updated jump coordinates," she said. "We've mapped blind spots and conquered patrol routes, places where sensor coverage overlaps just enough to create static shadows. You can slip through there if you're quiet." Marcus nodded. He didn't ask how she knew. He trusted her. Everyone trusted each other now. That was the strange gift of the banishment. It had stripped away the noise and left only what mattered. Training intensified. Pilots practiced flying without emitting heat signatures. Comms officers learned to mimic the static of dead comets. Engineers built decoy drones that looked like space junk but carried tiny data bursts. None of it was flashy. None of it broke the Concorde's laws, technically. But all of it prepared for the day when Earth would speak again, not with pleas but with proof. Lila's team ran simulations too. They fed their lexicon package into captured Concorde legal simulators, old units bought from black market traders before the ban. Each time the AI stuttered, one test involved a fictional case. A trader from a conquered species sold a ship to a human, then demanded it back after the ban. The Concord law said all human contracts were void, but the lexicon package inserted a human precedent. A deal made in good faith cannot be undone by later rules. The simulator froze for 17 minutes before declaring the case unresolvable under current framework. Lila smiled. That was the goal. On Mars, in hidden domes beneath the red dust, factories ran nonstop. They weren't building weapons. They were printing data crystals, millions of them, each loaded with curated fragments of human culture. A jazz solo, a child's drawing, a transcript of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a clip of a dog reuniting with its owner after years. These weren't meant to convince. They were meant to confuse. To make the conquered ask, why would a species capable of this be dangerous? The world's children were taught new lessons, not about hating the Concorde, but about understanding systems. Teachers explained how rules could be bent without breaking, how silence could be louder than shouting, how showing up quietly in the right place at the right time could change everything. Parents told bedtime stories about clever foxes who outwitted wolves not by fighting, but by making the wolf question his own hunger. Marcus took his first real test flight 3 months in. He ghosted past the lunar quarantine line, then looped around the far side of Jupiter, staying in the planet's magnetic shadow. No alarms sounded. No patrols came. He returned with a single message: "They don't even look anymore." That was the key. The Concorde assumed obedience. They assumed fear. They never imagined that humanity would respond to exile not with surrender, but with strategy. Lila finalized the lexicon package. It was ready, not as a bomb but as a seed. She loaded it onto a microdrive no bigger than a fingernail. It would travel with Marcus on his first mission beyond the Sol border. Their target wasn't a military base or a capital world. It was Port Vexus, a neutral trade hub where Concorde laws were enforced loosely, and data flowed freely through public archives. If they could plant the package there in the open legal library used by dozens of species, it would spread on its own. Like pollen on the wind, no one celebrated. There were no speeches, just quiet nods in dim rooms, hands shaking over shared coffee, eyes that held both fear and fire. Earth wasn't trying to win back a seat at the table. It was building a new table, one where chaos wasn't a flaw, but a feature. And as Marcus prepped the Odyssey's whisper for its long journey, and Lila double-checked every line of code in the package, they both knew the same truth. Humanity hadn't been silenced. They'd just changed the language. The Odyssey's whisper slipped past the last Sol patrol like a shadow through fog. Marcus Bell sat alone in the cockpit, hands resting lightly on the controls, eyes fixed on the starfield ahead. Behind him, Earth was a pale blue speck, already fading into the black. Ahead lay the Cathari expanse, and beyond it, Port Vexus, the first real test of everything they'd built in silence. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. Not from nerves, but from habit. Sleep was a luxury he'd traded for readiness. The ship hummed softly, its phase shield holding steady, bending light and sensor waves around its hull. To any Concorde scanner, it was just another piece of cosmic dust drifting through the void. Marcus checked the nav computer again. The route Nora had given him snaked through blind zones. Gaps in patrol coverage where overlapping sensor fields created static dead zones. He'd rehearsed the path 100 times in simulators. Now he flew it for real. 2 weeks into the journey, he made a minor course correction near a derelict mining station. The move was risky, close enough to be seen if someone looked hard, but necessary. The Concord rarely monitored old human outposts. They assumed no one would return. Marcus used the station's wreckage as cover, docking the Whisper inside a collapsed hangar bay. He stepped out in a patched pressure suit, not to repair anything but to plant a small relay node. It looked like scrap metal, but it carried a coded ping that would tell Earth the mission was still alive. He tapped the node twice, once for luck, once for Lila, then climbed back in. Port Vexus appeared on the view screen 3 days later. It wasn't a planet, but a massive ring-shaped station orbiting a quiet yellow star. Ships of all shapes and sizes came and went, some sleek and official, others battered and patched like his own. Concord enforcers patrolled the main docking arms, but the outer rings were lawless, run by traders, smugglers, and species the Concord tolerated but never trusted. That was where Marcus would go. He approached slowly, mimicking the drift pattern of a failing cargo hauler. His transponder broadcast a fake ID, MV Rust Bucket, registered to a defunct Beltron freight company. The signal was weak, glitchy, just enough to seem real. A traffic controller barked in guttural Cathari, demanding he power down engines and await inspection. Marcus complied, cutting main thrusters but keeping the phase shield at low hum. As the inspection drone floated near, he triggered a burst of electromagnetic static from the ship's hull, just enough to blur its sensors for 3 seconds. In that window, the Whisper's true outline vanished. The drone saw only a hollow shell, empty and dead. Derelict confirmed, the controller said, voice bored. Tow it to Bay 47. Salvage claim open in 72 hours. Perfect. Marcus let the automated tug pull him into the bay, a dark, echoing cavern lined with broken ships and forgotten cargo. He waited until the bay doors sealed and the lights dimmed before powering up again. He changed into plain trader clothes, brown jacket, worn boots, no insignia, and tucked Lila's microdrive into a hidden pocket. Then he stepped out onto the gantry. Port Vexus smelled like oil, ozone, and something sweetly alien. Spice from the Varelli's markets, maybe. Aliens moved in every direction, some towering, some tiny, all speaking in clicks, hums, or sharp syllables. Marcus kept his head down, walking like a man who'd lost everything but still had bills to pay. He didn't look at enforcers. He didn't make eye contact. He just moved toward the central data hub, a public archive where traders filed contracts, checked tariffs, and accessed legal references. It was open to all. That was the point. Inside, the archive was a maze of glowing terminals and floating text panels. Most users were focused on trade codes or shipping manifests. Marcus found an unattended terminal near the back, its screen flickering slightly. He plugged in a dummy port, then slid Lila's drive into a concealed slot beneath the console. The upload began instantly, silent, encrypted, disguised as a routine tariff update from a minor freighter. The lexicon package flowed into the system like water into cracks. It took 12 seconds. Then the drive self-erased. Marcus pulled the dummy port, turned, and walked away without looking back. He spent the next 2 days blending in. He bought stale bread from a Grix vendor. He watched a street performer juggle plasma orbs. He even sat in a dim bar nursing a drink that tasted like burnt metal, listening to rumors. No one noticed him. No alarm sounded. The Concord had no idea what had just happened, but changes began almost at once. A Xanthari merchant arguing over a damaged shipment suddenly cited an Earth legal principle: intent outweighs form. The arbitrator, a stiff-backed Orlan, paused. That phrase wasn't in Concord code, but it sounded logical. He allowed the argument to proceed. Nearby, a Cathari data clerk reviewing old trade logs stumbled on a footnote referencing jury nullification, the idea that ordinary people could reject a law they deemed unjust. She flagged it as an anomaly but couldn't delete it. The system required her to log it for review. Within hours, the lexicon package had seeded itself into a dozen legal disputes. It didn't force conclusions. It just asked questions, and in a system built on absolute answers, questions were dangerous. Marcus returned to the Whisper on the third night. As he powered up for departure, a public alert flashed on a nearby screen. System anomaly detected in Archive Sector Gamma. Routine maintenance underway. He smiled faintly. They'd noticed. Too late, the journey home was quieter. No patrols challenged him. No drones scanned his ship. The Concord was too busy untangling the first knots in their perfect legal web. Back on Earth, Lila watched the first reports trickle in through encrypted channels. A minor trade case in the Helios belt had been delayed because both sides quoted conflicting Earth precedents. A cultural tribunal on Varelli's Prime was reviewing whether human poetry could be classified as subversive logic. It was working. Marcus landed in Nevada under a full moon. Nora met him at the hangar door. She didn't ask if he'd succeeded. She saw it in his eyes. They think rules are walls, Marcus said, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in weeks. Now they're finding out walls can talk, Nora replied, and far away, in the heart of the Concord, the first whispers of doubt had taken root. Not from guns or fleets, but from words planted like seeds in dry soil, waiting to grow. The lexicon package did not explode. It bloomed. At first, the Concord dismissed the odd legal references as glitches or rogue data, but soon the anomalies multiplied. A minor dispute between two trading houses over faulty plasma coils turned into a 3-week deadlock when one side argued, using an Earth precedent, that a contract signed under false hope is no contract at all. The tribunal had no rule for false hope. It wasn't in their code. They paused the case, requesting clarification from the High Council. That request sat unanswered for days because the council was already buried under similar queries. Lila Torres watched it all from her underground station in Geneva. Screens lined the walls, each showing live feeds from public Concord courts, trade hubs, and data forums. She saw judges hesitate. She saw enforcers argue among themselves. She saw species that had followed Concord law without question for centuries now asking, but what if the rule is wrong? That was the seed taking root. On Varelli's Prime, a young Cathari scholar named Joran published a paper titled The Human Paradox, Chaos as Consensus. It argued that Earth's messy legal history wasn't weakness. It was a form of adaptive intelligence. The paper spread fast. Students quoted it. Traders used its logic in negotiations. Even a few Concord clerks began citing it in internal memos. The High Council tried to ban the paper, but banning it required a legal justification, and the justification itself triggered another debate about censorship versus order. The ban never passed. Marcus Bell, meanwhile, flew again. Not alone this time. 3 ghost ships now moved through the edges of Concord space, not to fight, but to listen. They hovered near trade lanes, picking up chatter on open channels. What they heard wasn't panic, it was confusion. Species were arguing not with weapons, but with ideas. A Xanthari envoy told an Orlan delegate, "Your law says one thing, but your actions say another. Which do we follow?" The Orlan had no answer. Back on Earth, factories shifted once more. They stopped building just data crystals and started printing small, simple devices, handheld translators loaded with curated Earth philosophies. These weren't sold. They were left behind, on benches in neutral ports, in cargo holds of departing freighters, in market stalls run by sympathetic traders. Each device looked like a common tool, but when activated it played short audio clips. A Martin Luther King speech, a line from Shakespeare about mercy, a child explaining why sharing is fair. No propaganda. Just humanity, raw and real. The Concord tried to contain it. They issued a new directive. All unverified Earth origin data is hereby classified as memetic hazard level 3. But enforcing it meant scanning every data packet, every spoken word, every public archive. Their system wasn't built for that. It was built for clear lines and clean answers. Now everything was blurry. Then came the Kethari Orlan collapse. It started over a simple trade, 10,000 units of biofuel. The Cathari claimed the Orlan delivered diluted product. The Orlan said the contract allowed for acceptable variance. Normally, a tribunal would decide based on past rulings, but this time both sides pulled Earth precedents. The Cathari cited a 21st century human case where a buyer won because the spirit of the deal mattered more than the letter. The Orlan countered with a different Earth ruling that said precision in terms prevents future harm. The tribunal tried to weigh them, but the precedents contradicted each other, and both were logically sound within Earth's framework. The case stalled. Then the appeals process stalled. Then the regional court froze. Within a week, the entire trade corridor between Cathari and Orland space ground to a halt. Ships sat idle. Goods spoiled. Credits stopped moving. For the first time in 200 years, the Concord's economy hiccuped. Panic spread, not of invasion but of uncertainty. Species that had never questioned the system now whispered in corridors. What if the rules can't handle everything? That thought was more dangerous than any fleet. Lila's team worked around the clock. They didn't add more data. They didn't need to. The original package was self-replicating. Every time someone used an Earth idea in a legal argument, the system logged it as a new precedent. And every new precedent made the next one easier to accept. It was a snowball rolling downhill. Marcus returned from his latest run with a captured data log from a Concord patrol ship. Buried in routine reports was a private message from a mid-level enforcer to his superior. We cannot police thought. If every species starts choosing which laws to honor based on feeling, the Concord ends. The message was marked urgent. It was never answered. On Earth, people didn't celebrate. They prepared. Schools taught students how to build consensus from disagreement. Engineers designed open-source signal relays that could broadcast Earth's cultural archive to any willing receiver. Artists painted murals of scales balancing fire and water, not to show conflict but harmony and tension. The Concord High Council held emergency sessions behind closed doors. Some members demanded military action, send ships to Sol, enforce the quarantine with force. But others pointed out the obvious. Earth hadn't broken a single law. They hadn't attacked. They hadn't spied. They'd only shared ideas, and the Concord's own laws protected the sharing of non-harmful knowledge. To punish Earth now would mean admitting their system was flawed, which would cause even more chaos. So they did nothing. And in doing nothing, they lost control. Lila received a message from an unknown sender on a neutral channel. It was short. Your words are in our courts. Our children ask about your poets. What do you want? She didn't reply. The question wasn't for her. It was for Earth. And Earth's answer was already spreading, quietly, patiently, like light through cracks. Marcus stood on the hangar roof one night, looking up at the stars. He thought about the Concord enforcers, sitting in their perfect chambers trying to hold back a tide with paper walls. He felt no joy, only resolve. They had tried to lock humanity away because they feared what they didn't understand. Now they were learning that some things can't be locked. Some things grow stronger in the dark. And far across the galaxy, in courtrooms and markets and quiet homes, the first true cracks in the Concord's order had turned into fractures. Not from war, from words, from the simple, stubborn human belief that no rule is sacred if it hurts people. The system was unraveling, and humanity hadn't lifted a finger to break it. They'd just shown it a mirror. The Concord did not fall with a bang. It unraveled with a sigh. After months of legal gridlock, trade delays, and rising unrest among its member species, the High Council made a decision no one expected. They voted quietly without fanfare to repeal the Edict of Quarantine. The motion passed with little debate. The galaxy had changed, and even the most rigid minds could see it. Earth was no longer a problem to contain. It was a question they could no longer ignore. A formal message was sent to Sol. Not a command. Not a demand. An invitation. The Galactic Concord requests the reintegration of Earth into the community of spacefaring civilizations. All prior restrictions are hereby void. On Earth, the message arrived in Geneva, routed through a dozen secure channels before landing on Lila Torres's terminal. She read it once, then again. She didn't smile. She called Marcus. He was in Nevada, overseeing final checks on the Odyssey's Whisper. When he heard the news, he just nodded. They think this fixes it, he said. They still don't get it, Lila agreed. Rejoining the Concord on their terms would mean pretending the past never happened. It would mean accepting that their rules were right all along and humanity had simply been misunderstood. But that wasn't true. The truth was messier, deeper. The Concord's rules weren't wrong. They were incomplete. And humanity had proven that by doing nothing more than being itself. Earth's response came 3 days later. Not through diplomats, not through military channels, through a live broadcast beamed directly to every public screen in Concord space, from trade ports to council chambers to schoolyards on Varelli's Prime. The speaker was not a general or a president. It was a teacher from Nairobi, chosen by lottery. Her name was Amina Cole. She stood in a simple blue dress with Earth's sunrise glowing behind her. "You banned us because we did not fit your rules," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You said we were too loud, too strange, too full of questions. But rules that cannot bend will break, and yours were already cracking before we said a word." She paused, letting the silence settle. "We do not want back in. We want you to see that your system was never whole without us. Not because we are better, but because we are different. And difference is not danger. It is fuel." Then she announced Earth's offer. Not to rejoin the conquered, but to build something new. The Open Accord. A framework with no fixed laws, only shared principles, adaptability, mutual respect, and the right to question. No species would be forced to join. No idea would be banned for being strange. Disagreements would not be settled by rigid precedent, but by dialogue, compromise, and sometimes by simply agreeing to disagree. The broadcast ended. No music, no slogans, just the image of Earth turning slowly in the sun. At first, the conquered was silent. Then, the fractures became chasms. Within a week, 17 species formally withdrew from the conquered. They cited inflexible governance and suppression of cultural evolution. Most of them sent messages to Earth asking how to join the Open Accord. Others didn't ask. They just started using its principles in their own courts and trade deals. Marcus flew the Odyssey's Whisper one last time. Not as a ghost, but as an ambassador. He docked openly at Port Vexus, this time with Earth's new emblem on his hull, a circle made of many lines, none of them straight. No enforcers stopped him. Traders waved. A young Cathari child pressed a small carved stone into his hand and said, "My teacher says your poet saved us." Back on Earth, Lila stood in the same Geneva basement where it all began. But now the screen showed something new, not just Concord feeds, but live links from a dozen worlds. Classrooms studying Earth history, engineers sharing open-source designs, artists collaborating across species. The lexicon package was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. The old Concord still existed, but it was a shadow. Its laws still stood, but fewer followed them. Its council still met, but fewer listened. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson. Order without flexibility is just another kind of prison. Marcus and Lila met on the lunar surface, at a new observation deck built near the old quarantine line. Below them, Luna Station bustled with ships from species Earth had never even known existed a year ago. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to learn, to talk, to share. They thought banning us would make the galaxy safer, Marcus said, watching a Varelli's shuttle dock smoothly beside a human freighter. Instead, it made them see how fragile their safety really was, Lila replied. They didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. The work was done. Not with fire or force, but with patience, with words, with the quiet courage to be different in a universe that demanded sameness. Humanity never broke the Concord's rules. They simply lived in a way that made those rules meaningless. And in doing so, they gave the galaxy something it didn't know it needed, the freedom to change. Far below, on Earth, children played in parks under open skies. They didn't know about the vote, the banishment, the silent war of ideas. They only knew that the stars were no longer closed. And that was enough.